What if I told you there is a world out there where you're a movie star? A world where you just won the Nobel Prize? A world where you're as rich as Bill Gates? According to quantum mechanics, these things are not only possible, they're real. One of the fundamental experiments that led to the creation of quantum mechanics is something called the double-slit experiment. The double-slit experiment shows how light particles can behave like both waves and particles, depending on if you're trying to observe them or not. One theory goes that the act of observing a particle causes it to somehow change its state. But another theory goes that no, it's not that some force is causing it to change states. What's actually happening is that the act of measuring the particle causes an actual split in the universe, one where every possible outcome is happening simultaneously. This is called the many worlds theory. Expanding on this theory is the idea that every one of your decisions is being played out by a different you on a parallel Earth. A parallel Earth where you're fabulously wealthy, where you're married to your high school sweetheart even though you broke up years ago, where you're a Supreme Court justice. According to the many worlds theory, all these things are not only possible, they're happening right now. But what if, through some weird cosmic fluke, you could actually travel between these universes? Suddenly, you appear in one of these alternate dimensions where your life is just a little bit different, or a lot different. What would you do? And is this even possible? One of the most famous such stories in history comes to us from the 1950s, when a stranger appeared at a Japanese airport claiming to come from a country that did not exist. The story of the Man From Taured has become legendary in internet folklore. But what if I told you there really was a man from Taured, and his story is a lot stranger than you think? On a hot summer day in July 1954, a man arrived at Tokyo's Haneda Airport. At first glance, the man appeared completely unremarkable. He was of average height, bearded, Caucasian, and was well dressed in a tailored suit. He seemed well-cultured and spoke both French and Japanese. He could have been any one of thousands of international business travelers. On the surface, nothing about him appeared out of the ordinary. Not until he handed over his passport. At first glance, the man's passport seemed legitimate. It bore several stamps showing the man had crossed international borders several times before. The real problem was when the immigration officer took a closer look at that passport. That's when the officer noticed that it said the man came from the country of Taured. None of the immigration officers at the airport had ever heard of Taured before. That's because, as far as anyone knew, it was not a real country that existed anywhere on planet Earth. The officers confronted the man about the seemingly fictional country. The stranger grew agitated and kept insisting that Taured was a real place. He was born there, after all. It was a small but proud country, one that had been in existence for nearly 1,000 years. The Japanese officers then pulled out a map and told the man to point to Taured. But as the man traced his fingers along the map, his brow furrowed, and he looked increasingly perplexed. Taured should have been right where the map said the Principality of Andorra was, wedged in between Spain and France. The officers weren't sure what to make of this mystery man. The man appeared just as bewildered as they were. Not only did he have his passport, which seemed to originate from this non-existent country, but he was also able to show them documents written in a language no one had ever seen before. He even had coins and paper currency in his wallet that had been issued from Taured. None of this made sense. But if this was all some sort of con, it was more elaborate than anything any of these officers had ever seen before in their lives. On the off chance that the man was indeed some sort of criminal, the officers decided to detain him overnight in a nearby hotel while they performed a further investigation. They stationed a pair of guards outside his room, but the following morning when they opened the door to the man's room, they were shocked to see that the man had vanished. This was impossible. There was no way the man could have gotten past the guards. The story of the Man From Taured has gone down in history as one of the most famous tales of someone allegedly crossing over from a parallel universe. This was a universe where the country of Taured really existed. And somehow, the man accidentally crossed over into our universe, then crossed back again. And it's not the only such story like it. In 2008, a woman named Lorena Garcia posted comments on a Spanish website claiming that she had somehow jumped to a parallel universe. At first, she thought she had suffered some sort of psychotic break, but she eventually came to believe that she had somehow jumped dimensions. It started after she woke up but the sheets on her bed were different. This wasn't a big deal and she didn't think much about it. But from there, the differences she noticed in her life only grew even more confusing. When she went to work that day, she discovered her office was no longer her office, and she had a different supervisor she didn't recognize. She went home and found out that she was still in a relationship with her ex-boyfriend, even though she was certain she had broken up with him months earlier. She remembered her sister having surgery on her arm, although her entire family, including her sister, insisted that never happened. Another such incident comes to us from the year 1851. That was when a lost man appeared in a small German village, Frankfurt an der Oder. The man spoke broken German, and he began begging people for help. He said his name was Jofar Vorin, and like the man from Taured, he claimed to come from a country that did not exist. He said that he came from a place called Laxaria. When the authorities showed him a globe, he claimed he didn't recognize any of the countries on it. He said that the world he came from had 5 main continents on it: Sakria, Aflar, Astar, Oslar, and Uplar. But of all the stories of people allegedly jumping between universes, the most famous one of all is that of the Man From Taured. According to the popular legend, as the immigration officials dug into the man's story further, they discovered several more confusing clues. The man's passport had numerous stamps from airports all around the world, including Tokyo, and they all looked legitimate. The man insisted he was a businessman who worked for an international firm, yet the company the man said he worked for claimed to have never heard of him. Perhaps the most perplexing part of the tale has to be the man's disappearance from the hotel room. The room didn't have any balcony and was several floors up. There were 2 guards posted outside the room, which meant it was impossible for him to have escaped. The man simply vanished. Some claim he returned to whatever parallel dimension he came from. Plenty of skeptics have poked holes in the story over the years, claiming the entire thing is nothing but a work of fiction. The stories I mentioned here are fun anecdotes, and you can find plenty of others much like them. But in the end, there's just no real evidence to back them up. But what if I told you there actually was a man from Taured? And even though his story doesn't involve the paranormal, it's still plenty weird. According to Snopes.com, the story of the Man From Taured was inspired by a real-life con artist named John Allen Zegrus, who was arrested in 1960 in Japan for trying to cash phony checks after using a fake passport to get into the country. In October 1960, a 36-year-old man named John Allen Zegrus entered Japan with his Korean wife. 3 months later, he was arrested by the Tokyo Metropolitan Police, suspected of identity fraud. On July 29, 1960, the man's story was even mentioned by a member of the British House of Commons, who referred to John Allen Zegrus as a foreign intelligence agent working for Colonel Gamal Abdel Nasser of the Egyptian government. It turns out that the man known as Zegrus was a con man who got a kick out of seeing how many countries he could travel to with a completely made-up story about a completely fictional country. His story even had an air of legitimacy about it, and nobody questioned him because of his claims that he worked for Egyptian intelligence. The House member went on to describe the man's passport as being issued in the city of Tamanrasset, the capital of the state of Taured. This was an independent state that Zegrus claimed housed about 2 million people south of the Sahara. Of course, he was full of crap, but he talked a good game, so people believed him. Over time, Zegrus invented all sorts of fictional details about his phony country, including its history, capital, customs, and language. Whenever any customs officials questioned his credentials, Zegrus had a story ready to wash over any suspicions. He would even adamantly point out a small proclamation stamped on his phony passport that he claimed was part of Taured's national seal. In truth, the saying was complete gibberish. It was only after Zegrus visited Tokyo that the jig was up. It was there at the Tokyo airport that Japanese officials first took a close look at the man's passport and declared it to be a fraud. Soon after, they arrested Zegrus and took steps to prosecute him. At one point during his arrest, Zegrus attempted suicide. He unsuccessfully attempted to slash his own wrists with a piece of broken glass. Ultimately, John Allen Zegrus never actually served any time in prison. The Japanese authorities held him in detention longer than any prison sentence he would have ever received, so he was ultimately released for time served. It's not known what happened to the real John Allen Zegrus after he left Japan. No one ever learned where he came from, and no one knew where he went after leaving the country. Although the name of John Allen Zegrus eventually faded into obscurity, his story took on a strange life of its own. It seems that somehow over time the story morphed into the strange tale of the man from another universe. But because there are no records showing exactly where John Allen Zegrus went after leaving Japan, the man completely drops out of the historical record after that. For all we know, maybe he really did cross over into another dimension. The Conspirators is written and produced by me, Nate Hale, an entirely fictional identity. Thanks for checking out this video. If you'd like to learn even more about another potential explanation for alternate universes, then check out my other video about why we're all living in the Matrix.